Hello, everyone. This is Francesca Vigliani from Cloud Academy. Thank you for joining us for this Office Hours webinar. As you know, this particular webinar series is highly interactive. A few weeks ago, we sent out a survey proposing 3 different Azure topics, and you decided what this webinar would focus on. Following the announcement of the topic, we were very excited to see how many questions came in. So thank you for actively participating in the process. I'm very happy to announce that this session will focus on the Azure Administration Cert, one of the most sought after Azure certifications around. And during this session, our experts will go over the AZ-103 and AZ-104 exams, answering the most popular questions you sent us, while also answering any other questions that might come in during the live webinar. Before introducing our speakers, I'd like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you via email. Lastly, we will leave ample time for your live questions, so feel free to add them in the chat box, and our experts will try to answer them during the Q&A. All right, I'm all done with the announcements, so without further ado, let me introduce you to the speakers of this webinar. Guy Hummel, Azure Content Lead, and Tom Mitchell, Azure Trainer. Take it away, Guy.
Thanks, Francesca. All right, so we're going to start off with going over the details of the AZ-103 and AZ-104 exams. And then we'll go through a couple of sample questions that we've put together to give you an idea of what it would be like taking questions on the exam and how to go through those. Then we're going to spend quite a bit of time going over questions that were submitted before the webinar. As Francesca said, we had lots and lots of questions come in, so that was great. And then we'll move to the live Q&A. So you can submit questions in the chat window as we go during the webinar. And when we get to that part of the webinar, then Tom and I will take a shot at answering them for you. So with that, we'll move on to the exam details. And I'll hand it over to Tom for this.
Thanks, Guy. So just recently, the AZ-104, we should start off by mentioning, did come out of beta. Now, this AZ-104 exam is basically a reincarnation of the AZ-103, which is going to expire later on in August. Now, if you've already passed the AZ-103 exam, since that already focuses on the Administrator Associate skills, you don't have to take the AZ-104. It's sufficient for your certification. Now, that being said, while the majority of the topics for the AZ-103 are the same as they are in AZ-104, there are some differences between the two exams, and we'll touch on some of those as we move throughout this webinar.
Well, in fact, we'll touch on some of them right now. So on the left, we have AZ-103, and on the right, we have AZ-104. And it's a lot of text to read, but if you go through it, you'll see that they're actually quite similar. Particularly number 2, implement and manage storage, is exactly the same for both exams. Some of them are just slightly different, like number 4 is configure and manage virtual networks on the left, and it's configure and manage virtual networking on the right. So they're basically the same. They have made a few changes though. The biggest ones are in sections 1 and 5. So basically what they've done is a reorganization. So they've taken from the AZ-103 exam, they've taken some things from section 1 and section 5, and they've combined them into section 1 for the new exam. And then similarly for section 5, they've taken a couple of pieces from, it's actually sections 1 and 2, I think, from the first exam, and they've combined them into section 5 for AZ-104. So it's mostly a reorganization, but as we'll show you, there are definitely some differences in terms of what gets covered, because Microsoft is constantly coming out with new things, new services, and also end-of-lifing or de-emphasizing some other services. So we'll get onto that in a little bit. We're going to go through the AZ-104 exam now, especially because it's out of beta. The AZ-103 exam is not going to be around for a really long time. So if you're just starting out getting prepared, it makes a lot more sense to prepare for AZ 104. So that's what we're going to go through right now. And then at the end of this, we'll talk about what the actual differences are in terms of services covered between the two exams. So I'll hand it back to you, Tom.
Thank you, Guy. So the AZ 104 is broken down into it's 5 sections, 5 top level overarching exam objectives, and each one of those objectives applies to a certain percentage of the exam. Now, what I want to talk about here are the objectives that revolve around managing identities and governance. Now, when you get in and you start managing an Azure subscription, you need to know some basic identity level stuff in order to be an effective administrator. And the exam is going to test you on that stuff, on those topics. Some of the top level topics that this part of the exam will look for is your knowledge as far as managing Azure AD objects goes. And that includes users, groups, devices, anything that you need to manage within Azure AD. You're going to need to know how to do that, and the exam is going to ping you on those topics. You'll also need to know how to set up and manage access to Azure objects through role-based access control. If you don't know how to grant access to different services and different resources in Azure, you're going to have a problem with the exam. And the same thing goes for managing the subscriptions themselves and the governance of those subscriptions. Essentially, what Microsoft is going to do is really kind of ping you on services like Azure Active Directory, the RBAC service itself. You're going to need to know how to manage your subscription, how to manage the resource groups within those subscriptions. And you'll also need to know the differences between these terms. And of course, you'll need to know how to manage Azure policy within your subscription, so you can essentially almost automate or make things easier on yourself when you're managing the resources within your subscription.
And I'll just point out a couple of things. So as Tom mentioned, each one of these sections, there's a percentage. In this case, it's 15 to 20%. So that's approximately how much of the exam is going to be on this particular section. It's not going to be exact, but after taking these exams, I've seen that they're reasonably accurate in terms of the percentage of the exam for each section. The other thing is that the top part of this slide, so where we say 1, 2, 3, we've taken those directly from the exam guide, the AZ 104 exam guide, which I highly recommend that you look at as you're preparing for the exam, because there are more details than what we've shown here, but we're just kind of going over the highlights of what's in each one of these sections. Anything else, Tom, before I move on to the next one?
No, I mean, that pretty much covers it. That 15 to 20%, tells you that Microsoft wants to know if you know these things, but it's probably not going to be a giant piece of the exam, but
right,
20% of an exam is still 20%.
Yeah, as we'll see in a minute, some of these are much bigger sections. So not this one though. So the next one is implement and manage storage. It's only 10 to 15%. And so you need to know how to manage storage accounts, how to manage data in Azure storage, and how to configure Azure files and Azure blob storage. So basically it all comes down to Azure storage, different forms of it. Azure files is a little bit specialized because it's more about creating file shares. So the services and concepts that you need to know, so as I mentioned, Azure storage, but there are also some particular aspects that are really important. So secure access to storage, and in particular, keys and shared access signatures. And shared access signatures have actually been evolving quite a bit over time. So yep. even if you're aware of what those are, you should take another look at them, because there are different forms of those and different ways to use them. There's also storage tiers, which is like hot, cool, archive. So if you have data that's going to be accessed frequently, you'd use the hot storage tier. And if you have data that's almost never going to be accessed, then you use the archive storage tier to save money, things like that. But you need to know the details.
Yeah, and that's something I was going to point out. I'm glad you touched on it. you're not going to only have to know what these storage tiers are, but you may encounter a lab or some kind of scenario where you're asked questions around, what kind of storage works but saves you money, and you're going to need to know the difference between hot storage, cool storage versus archive. Some of these storage tiers are more expensive on access, some are more expensive on the actual dumb storage itself. So keep that in mind when you're going through this, that you're paying attention to the costing, and a way to do that would be to take a look at the Azure pricing calculator.
Right. And also, like in this case, if you use archive storage, it's going to take a lot longer to retrieve that data when you do. So yeah, there are a lot of aspects to it, even though it seems relatively simple. Then there are different ways to access the storage, and a couple of the important ones are Azure Storage Explorer and AZ Copy. The first one is a GUI-based tool, and the second one is a command line tool. And then Azure File Sync to keep your files synced up between on-premises and in the cloud. All right. I'll let you take that, Tom.
Next, we have compute resources. And if you look at the percentage of the exam here, we're talking 25 to 30% of the exam. So this is a large chunk of the exam. And it's not surprising. I mean, in Azure, Azure offers, 200 plus different services or whatever it is now. Compute is by far the most popular, and the exam kind of reflects that. So when you sit the AZ 104, you're going to need to know a lot about the compute resources that are offered. You're going to need to know how to configure your VMs for high availability, and as well as how to make them scalable. You'll need to know how to automate the deployments and the configuration of VMs. So while you may be able to go into the Azure portal and click a couple buttons and deploy a VM, I mean, that's great, but it's probably not going to get you what you need for the exam. The AZ 104 is going to ping you on ARM templates. It's going to ping you on ways that you can automate that configuration rather than just clicking a couple buttons and deploying a VM. And that's obviously bullet 3 here, creating and configuring VMs, but that's a really basic view of what they're looking for. Now, while we have lots of focus on the compute resources in terms of VMs, the core or the exam is also going to ask you about containers and web apps. Now, these two topics are possibly new to a lot of existing administrators. If you're coming from an on-prem environment and you're kind of newer to Azure, you may not have done a lot of work with containers and web apps. And if you haven't, you're going to need to understand how to configure these types of services, because the exam is going to ask you about them. So essentially, what you want to do is really kind of bone up on Azure virtual machines, the ARM templates, Kubernetes, the Azure Container Instances service, and then of course the app service that allows you to deploy web apps. If you're not really familiar with these key services and concepts, you're kind of limiting yourself in terms of how successful you can be with the exam, because like I said up top, we're talking a quarter to almost a third of the exam is going to focus on these specific topics. And if you don't understand them well enough to use them, you're going to have some problems.
Yeah, and I should point out that on AZ 103, the title of this section was different, and it was focused on VMs, because it used to be that when you were talking compute on Azure, you were talking VMs pretty much, right? And so the fact that they've renamed this to just Azure Compute Resources, and VMs are just one of the things, right? And containers are very big, and then there's web apps. It just goes to show how much things are evolving here, that particularly with containers. I mean, containers are just exploding in popularity, and particularly Azure Kubernetes Service, which is still relatively new, right? Microsoft used to have Azure Container Service, and then when everybody started moving to Kubernetes, then the next version of it became just Azure Kubernetes Service, and you're seeing it more and more in these different certification exams, how important it is.
Yeah, it's definitely becoming a little more popular than it was even 6 months ago. I mean, it's exploding.
Yeah, it's really something. Okay. Now this might be a surprise to people. It was kind of a surprise to me that the virtual networking section is 30 to 35%. That it's in fact the largest section in the exam. You know, normally you think of compute and storage, and the networking is just kind of in the background. Yeah, you need it, but you know, you don't think of it as being kind of the most important thing. It's just that there are so many different network services, so many things that you need to know, that it does take up a lot of the exam. So we've got implement and manage virtual networking, configure name resolution, so Azure DNS, secure access to virtual networks, configure load balancing, and that's not even straightforward. There are a couple of different load balancers. Monitor and troubleshoot virtual networking, and there are different ways to do that as well. Integrate an on-premises network with an Azure virtual network, and there are multiple ways to do that. So these are actually quite complex topics. So some of the key services and concepts you need to know. So Azure virtual networks themselves, of course, that's the core of all this. But Azure DNS for name resolution. Then on the security side, you've got Azure Firewall, Azure Bastion, network security groups. There are others as well, but those are the key ones for this section. For the load balancers, we've got a couple different kinds of load balancers. There's Azure Application Gateway, which operates at kind of a higher level than Azure Load Balancer does. So it's layer 4, Azure Load Balancer is at layer 4, and Azure Application Gateway is at layer 7. Did I get that right, Tom?
I think it's the other way around, if I remember correctly. I'd have to look at their document, but I think it's the other way around. I think the load balancer will go to 7, but you could be right.
Okay, we'll have to look that up. I'm pretty sure it's the other way around. But
It could be.
anyway,
It could be.
I guess it just goes to show that it's probably more important to know what they do than what layer of the ISO stack they're at. Okay, and then Azure Network Watcher is where they're kind of pulling together all of the different troubleshooting tools. And then these different ways of connecting. So we've got the Azure VPN Gateway, which is a virtual private network gateway. Azure Express Route, which is where you can have a direct connection instead of going over the internet. You're directly connected to the Azure cloud. And then Azure Virtual WAN. So lots and lots of stuff here.
Yeah, and I can just imagine, I can imagine the sysadmins out there right now are just kind of rolling their eyes and shaking their heads because the networking stuff isn't stuff that a typical sysadmin deals with as often as the compute stuff. So unfortunately, we're talking 30 to 35% of the exam is networking. So there's no real way around it. Now, the good news is when it comes to monitoring and backup, it's kind of light, and mainly because there's not a whole lot involved. I mean, you need to know how to monitor your resources using the Azure Monitor service. Again, this is basic stuff. And then obviously implementing backup and recovery. I mean, these two topics are more about just managing your environment and managing the recovery of it. So the key services and concepts that you'll have to familiarize yourself with are the Azure Monitor service along with the application insight services. Azure Site Recovery is a service you'll use to recover from a data center failure, for example. While Azure Backup, you're recovering VMs and disks when there's problems. So again, it's a small piece of the exam, and it shouldn't be too terrible to learn these pieces, but don't ignore them because the exam will invariably ping you at least a few times on these services and concepts to make sure that you know how to not only deploy stuff, but to actually make sure it's running the way it's supposed to and to be able to recover from problems that occur. So keep that in mind.
All right, so now we're moving on to what's different in AZ 104. And, you know, when I was going through these to compare them, I was kind of surprised at just how many new services they're including in AZ 104, because AZ 103 is not that old of an exam, right? When just a few years ago, Microsoft had the exam was called 7533.
Yep.
That was their administrator exam back then. Then they switched to these role-based ones, and they went to AZ 100 and AZ 101. It actually used to be 2 exams. Then they decided to combine them both into AZ 103, and now they're moving on to AZ 104. So AZ 103 is actually quite recent. And despite that, there are all these new services that they've added. So we've got, and I should say, it's not necessarily that these services have come out since, very recently. It's just that in some cases they're adding them into the exam and they weren't there before. So we have Azure Disk Encryption, Azure Kubernetes Service, and Azure Container Instances, Azure App Service, Azure Firewall and Azure Bastion, Azure Application Gateway, Azure Virtual WAN, and Azure Application Insights. As far as what they removed, there's Azure AD Connect, which is Azure Active Directory Connect, multi-factor authentication, and PowerShell desired state configuration, or DSC. I have to say I was surprised at all 3 of these that they removed them, because they're all actually fairly important concepts. And on the previous exam, there was quite a bit to those. Tom, did you have any?
Yeah, seeing Azure AD Connect removed kind of stunned me. I mean, it's in use everywhere. I mean, if you have an on-prem AD and you're deploying Azure AD or even Office 365, you're probably using that. And it's a rather straightforward tool. I mean, there's not a ton of configuration out of the box that's really complicated, unless you want to get into like custom attributes and whatnot. But even as I'm looking at this, I'm kind of doing the German Shepherd head tilt, because that's kind of surprising that they wouldn't cover this on the exam. And the same thing goes for multi-factor authentication. I mean, there's this giant push for multi-factor authentication, and you're just going to pull it out of your exam, which that doesn't make any sense to me. The only thing that would make sense to me around that would be that, multi-factor authentication, for the most part, configuring it as a checkbox. I mean, you're turning it on, and users get to choose what factor they use. So maybe they took it out because there's not a whole lot to test on it. But it is kind of surprising. I was glad to see PowerShell desired state config go. I mean, you could do an entire course just on PowerShell desired state configuration. I mean, it's really deep, and it's really useful for configuring VMs. I'm glad to see it go, but it's kind of surprising that they pulled that out.
Yeah, I think that the reason that they pulled out multi-factor authentication is probably because they now have the AZ 500 exam, which is for security engineers, and maybe they figured, let's move some of those things over to these other exams, right?
Maybe.
Yeah, I suspect that's some of what's going on here. All right. So now we're moving on to your sample questions. The majority of this webinar is going to be about answering your questions. Answering your questions and also showing you some potential, I shouldn't say potential, because these are definitely not questions that will be on the exam, but questions that are sort of like what you might see on the exam. We're going to go through a couple of those, and then we'll go through your questions that you submitted. Okay, so for sample question number 1, Tom, can you take this?
Yeah, so let's read through this. So you're creating an ARM template to provision your VMs. You need to set your Windows Administrator password for those VMs, but you don't want the password to be visible in the ARM template file. So which is the best service to help you accomplish this task? Now, you're going to see questions like this that kind of really make you think, and they're going to give you answers that seem to make sense. Just look at the answer list here. Answer A is Azure Active Directory. So you would think, okay, that's kind of related to, passwords and administration. Same thing goes for the Azure VM agent. You'd think, well, maybe since we need to communicate with the VM, we have to, maybe use the Azure VM agent. Option C has the word authentication in the answer, since it's multi-factor authentication. So again, for someone who isn't sure of what the answer is here, would have to give that some thought. Azure Key Vault is actually the right answer here, option D. And that's because you use Azure Key Vault to store passwords, to store secrets, certificates, all that stuff that you don't want people seeing. That's where you're going to store that stuff. Now, what I do want to mention, this specific question here isn't too bad, but what you will run into on the exam are a lot of distractors, they're called. And you'll essentially have to decide which information is important to the question and which information isn't. So keep that in mind as you go through different questions, so you know what you're looking for and what really doesn't matter.
Right. And I will say too that this question is actually, in a way, relatively easy compared to a lot of the questions that you'll see on the exam. I don't know if easy is the right way to put it, but it's certainly less complicated than some of the ones that you'll see on the exam. But you do see some questions that are like this. So now we'll show you one that's a little bit more complicated with a lot more reading.
And this is what I was talking about.
Yeah. So, yeah, so there are a lot of things to keep in mind here. So I'll read through it quickly and then we'll talk about how you figure it out. So an Azure subscription named Subscription 1 contains 3 resource groups named Development, Test, and Production. Bob, Tracy, Larry, and Gail have been assigned roles via role-based access control, RBAC, to access Subscription 1 resources. Bob has been assigned the contributor role for the Development and Test resource groups. Larry can perform read and write operations on all resources in the Development and Test resource groups. Gail is an owner of the Development and Test resource groups. Tracy is an owner of Subscription 1. If necessary, who would be able to delete the entire development resource group and all resources within it? Choose all correct answers. So one of the interesting things about this, aside from the fact that it's such a complicated question, is that there are multiple correct answers and you have to get all of the correct answers, right? So it's, I think these are called multiple select or something. So you can't just, guess at one of the 4. It could be anywhere from 1 to, I guess, potentially 4, but probably not, are correct. So if you look through these, you have to know quite a bit to be able to figure this out. You have to understand how RBAC works and what the different RBAC roles are allowed to do. And not just that, there are some other things too. So we'll get into that. So Bob has been assigned the contributor role for the development and test resource groups. Now, if you look back at if you look down at the question below, you'll see that it's only the development resource group that we care about. And they like to put in extra information like the test resource group. Well, the test resource group is irrelevant. They're only asking about the development resource group. So you do have to sort of figure out what to ignore in the information that you're given. And okay, so Bob has the contributor role. Now, this is actually one of the trickier parts of this question, is whether Bob can actually delete the resource group or not, because I actually had to look this one up, because the contributor role is not normally something that you think of as the kind of role that has sort of complete power over things, right? Like being able to delete the entire resource group. But in this case, the contributor role actually can. So Bob is one of the correct answers. Larry can perform read and write operations on all resources in the development and test resource groups. So Larry can delete all of the resources within the development resource group, but he can't delete the entire resource group. So that one's not true. Gail is an owner of the development and test resource groups. Now, an owner for sure, this one is pretty obvious actually. If you're the owner of the resource group, then you're able to delete it. The next one, and I'll bring this up here so you can see, Tracy is an owner of Subscription 1. And you need to understand the hierarchy of how these permissions work and how inheritance works with the permissions. So we have a management group at the top, subscriptions underneath it, resource groups underneath that, and then resources underneath that. And the permissions flow down. So if you have the permissions at a higher level, then you have permissions for everything that's below that. So because Tracy is an owner of Subscription 1, she has total control over any resource groups that are under that subscription. and any resources that are under the resource groups. So Tracy is also someone who can delete the entire development resource group. So this answer actually, or this question actually has 3 correct answers: Bob, Gail, and Tracy. Anything you wanted to add on this, Tom?
Only that, you know, this question example here is really what you would expect to see on the exam. Almost every question on the exam is going to be like this. Very rarely are you going to get a 2-sentence question that says true or false. So I would really focus and prepare yourself for exam questions that look like this, because you do have to limit what you're looking at. And Guy, I think you and I were talking the other day, and I think you mentioned a good way to address these types of questions is almost to read them backwards. When we were talking, you mentioned a lot of times if you start with the actual question, which is usually the last sentence, and then kind of read back through the question with that in mind, you can usually more easily eliminate stuff that's not necessary. So when you see stuff like this, read through the question, understand what it is, but then really read the last, sentence or two that's asking, what's the ask for that specific question, and then go back and kind of, deconstruct it. I've actually found that to be really effective, and I think, Guy, that's a strategy you use as well.
Yeah, and some of these exams, it depends. Now, this particular exam I think is 3 hours long, which is quite a bit of time, although there are live labs in it, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So there's a lot to do in this exam, and you have to be very careful of your time. And so as you're going through it, when you get one of these questions that has a lot of information in it, you may need to be careful in how long you take to go through the question, because sometimes you'll spend like 10 minutes on a question and you're still actually not quite sure of the answer when you're done. And so by this time you're like, oh man, I can't do this on every question, right? I'm going to be in big trouble. I'm going to run out of time if I do that. And so you usually have to have a strategy of kind of read through the information really quickly, get to the question, and then go back and read it in more depth so that you can digest it more easily related to the question, because there is so much extraneous information that you don't need to know. And it's a lot easier to understand the information once you know what it is they're going to ask, right? So yeah, going through it kind of backwards in a way is the way to go. All right. Yeah. So moving on to your submitted questions. And as we mentioned, there are lots and lots of these. So we're going to go through the ones that were sort of the most popular questions. Lots of people asked similar questions, so we've kind of grouped them together. And we'll, so I guess, Tom, you can take the first one here.
Yeah, so the question is, what kinds of questions are on the AZ-104 exam? Are they simulations, screenshots, etc.? And the answer is really all of the above. When you sit the exam, you're going to encounter all kinds of questions, whether they're multiple choice, at least for me, the dreaded true false with repeated scenarios, drag and drops, which are basically fill in the blanks. You get to choose from drop-down menus. You'll have the case studies, and of course, the hands-on lab tasks. Multiple choice is probably the easiest of the bunch here, and even those are not necessarily easy. Basically, you read a question, and they give you a choice of one of any number of possible answers, and you get to check the box or the radio button that tells that you say is the right answer. The true false with repeated scenario is the bane of my existence. What you'll often find these, at least I've found, you'll often find these in the beginning of an exam for some reason.
Yeah, they're always at the beginning. And
yeah,
like I think, yeah, every Microsoft exam that I've taken in, I forget how long now, they always start with these ones. They've decided that they just love these questions, right?
Yeah.
And the reason they start with these is because they don't allow you to go back. Once you've answered one of these questions, you can't go back and change your answer. So I'll let you explain why.
Yeah, and these questions will freak you out if you've never encountered them before. You'll essentially get the first question will be something like, you need to deploy some SQL solution. and you got to address requirements X, Y, and Z. And then they'll give you a solution. We'll say deploy, Azure SQL services, and ask you, does this provide the solution? Yes, no, or true, false. And then you'll answer true or false. And then the next question is the exact same question with 1 or 2 words changed, or maybe 1 or 2 words changed in the answer. And then it asks you again, true or false, yes or no. And then you'll get another question, which is, again, almost identical with just slight changes. And you'll be asked yes or no, true or false. And I mean, it's possible that every answer is true or every answer is false. It's also possible that there's a combination. But the problem with these questions is you can't go back. With a typical multiple choice answer or question, you can usually mark it and go back and change it. With these, once you answer, it's a done deal. There's no going backwards. So by like the third question, you will often find yourself questioning your knowledge of what you're looking at, and you'll start to really kind of have some doubts on what you're reading. Just keep going and read the question for what it is. Forget the question that you read before it, because they're unrelated at the end of the day. The question you're answering is the question that's in front of you, regardless of what the answer was to the previous question. So don't get caught up in the weird, true, false, what's the difference between the questions, because you start to play mind tricks on yourself, and that's never good.
Yeah, these are the questions where you'll get to the third one and you'll be like, oh, I know I got that first one wrong, maybe the second one too, right? Because there was some key piece of information that they had left out of the answer or the solution on the first one or the second one, and you don't realize it until later when they give you the actual correct solution, and it's very frustrating.
Yeah, it drives you insane.
Yeah, because you would think true false questions would be the easiest ones on an exam, right? They should be even easier than multiple choice, but they're not. These are actually quite tricky.
Yeah, they found a way to make them tricky.
Yeah, and the other one I think I would point out is the lab tasks, that they don't necessarily have lab tasks on an exam. Some of them for sure don't have them. The AZ 103 and 104 exams do normally have them, but occasionally there might be a problem. I know, so for example, the AI 100 exam I took a while ago, and they normally have labs on the AI 100 exam, but at some point a while back, they were having problems with the labs for that exam. And so they stopped including the lab tasks. And they just said that they were going to try to bring them back at some point in the future. So in many cases, you don't know whether there are actually going to be lab tasks on the exam or not, even if you've talked to somebody who can tell you what their experience was when they took the exam, right? But if they do have lab tasks, they are, they're either, I find that they're either the easiest or the hardest, depending on how much hands-on experience you have, right? Yep. So if you've done a lot of hands-on work, the lab tasks can actually be quite easy, because they don't give you, they're not going to give you something that's really complicated that's going to take a long time, because they know you have to do it in a relatively short period of time on the exam. And so, yeah, quite often these things are relatively straightforward, and you can buzz through those and kind of boost your score that way. But if you don't have hands-on experience, then you're really going to be in trouble on these lab tasks. So.
Now, the thing I like about the lab tasks is the fact that it's not a wrong answer until you submit it. So if you're, let's say you get a lab task that asks you, it gives you the whole scenario of what you need to do, and it says, create a storage account. Just pick that at random. You can go in and do it all wrong, and until you click the submit button and you finish it, it doesn't matter. It's essentially, they're looking at the end game, that you were able to get it done correctly. And on that same note, there isn't necessarily one right way to do it. So you can arrive at the proper answer through a different avenue, and it still would be a right answer. So don't panic when you get these, but on the same token, don't slow things down. I mean, you're going to have to walk through these processes, and it could chew up time. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the case studies can definitely chew up a lot of time too, just because there's so much information on them. But yeah, let's move on to the next question. Okay, what are the prerequisites for taking the AZ-103 or AZ-104 exam? Well, the good news is there are no prerequisites. You can take the AZ-900 exam first if you'd like, but it's not required. So AZ-900 is the fundamentals exam, and it's the one that's intended for people who are not necessarily technical. You do actually have to know a fair bit of technical information to pass AZ-900, but it's, you know, if you were in a somewhat non-technical role, that's as far as you would go, is just that fundamentals exam. And if you're just getting started with Azure, you might want to do that one first before you take AZ-103 or 104, but you don't have to. And I should also point out that in the past, Microsoft almost always required you to pass 2 exams to get a particular certification. And they do in a couple of cases with the new role-based exam. So for the architect certification, you need AZ 300 and 301, for example, which is soon going to be AZ 303 and 304. Those are in beta right now. But anyway, with these exams, though, you only need to take 1 exam to get the certification. So you only need AZ 103 or 104 to get your administrator certification, and that's it. So, all right, let you take this, Tom.
A question that I see quite often is very similar to this one, and I'll just read it, right from the slide here. The web page for this certification says you should have at least 6 months of hands-on experience of administering Azure before taking the exam. Is this really necessary? Yes and no. And the reason I say that is, no, you don't have to have 6 months to take the exam. I mean, you can go read a book on Azure for 10 minutes and go take the exam, and probably not going to end well, but it's not required. Certainly going to be helpful. Now, you do need hands-on experience, because without the hands-on experience, you're not going to be able to complete the hands-on tasks that you're going to have to go through to pass the exam. So do you need 6 months of hands-on? Maybe not. If you can spend a good amount of time getting some stick time, that would be helpful. Some people might be able to learn this stuff in 2 weeks. Some might take 6 months. Ultimately, it's going to be up to the individual how much time they really need to prepare for it.
Yeah, and with the hands-on, I should also say that with the hands-on experience, that will also help you with the non-lab tasks, or the non-lab questions, because in many cases when you're studying for these things, it can be really hard to understand exactly what's going on just reading the documentation or going through a course. But when you actually go in and try it yourself, you're like, oh, okay, now it all comes together, and you understand how it works. So it's easier then to answer the questions that, like multiple choice questions. So even when it's not a lab task. And I will say that, thankfully, we're going to get to this in a minute as to how you can prepare for these exams. But luckily, we do have hands-on labs in our learning paths on Cloud Academy. So if you need to get the hands-on experience, you can do it that way. All right, let's move on to this one. It's a very related question to the last one. How long will it take to prepare for the exam? So it does vary depending on your prior knowledge and experience. It's really like, this is one of those it depends questions, right? There's no set amount of time needed to prepare, and there are no guarantees. There were some questions where people were asking, how can I guarantee that I'll pass the exam? Well, there's no way you can guarantee that you'll pass the exam. Sorry, but and there's, you can't say that, well, if I spend, I don't know, 6 months preparing for this exam, I should be able to pass it then, right? Well, not necessarily. So just to give you some guidance, because this is another question that people will ask us, is, if they take our learning path, say our AZ 104 learning path, how long will it take them to prepare for this exam? And the learning path at the moment, these learning paths do change over time, but at the moment it's about 45 hours long. But that doesn't mean that you can actually finish it in 45 hours, because typically you'll want to rewatch certain portions of it. You may pause after you get some new piece of information. You'll have to think about it. Afterwards, you may go through the transcripts of the courses to kind of review the material. There may be some other things that you look up, some other Microsoft documentation or whatever that you need to go through. There are lots of things that you need to do. And so as a general rule of thumb, I would say you need at least twice as long as the number of hours that it says is in the learning path. So for this particular one, you'd likely need at least 90 hours to go through it and thoroughly prepare. Some people may need more than that. You probably wouldn't take much less time than that, unless maybe you already have a lot of experience and you're just kind of breezing through this learning path. But that's probably not the case for most people.
And I should point out, don't try to shortcut this with dumps. Dumps are going to help you with some of the multiple choice maybe, but when you get into the case study and the
for those who aren't familiar with what dumps are, we should explain that.
Yeah, true.
There are some sites where they will get actual questions from the exams and put them on their sites, which of course completely violates Microsoft's agreement with taking the exam. You're not supposed to put actual questions out there, so we don't in our learning paths. We write new questions that are, that cover the material, but that aren't the actual questions from the exam. But there are these other sites, these sketchy sites that that will dump some of the questions from the exams. And now I'll hand it back to you, Tom, as to why that's not such a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, well, right out of the gate, there's no guarantee that the answers they have are right, and that's a common issue with a lot of different dumps, that the answers that are provided aren't even correct. And on top of that, the dumps don't help you with the labs, and the labs are slowly becoming a larger and larger portion of the exams. So while you might get a bunch of multiple choice questions right, when you're answering the next 20 questions or 25 questions that are all built upon the actual hands-on labs that you have to do, the dumps don't help you. So put the time in. I mean, there's no deadline here. There's not anything that's going to eliminate you because it took you 100 hours to prepare rather than 90. Just make sure you're ready for it, because if you try to shortcut it, you're just going to wind up costing yourself more money in exam fees.
Yeah. So a couple more points on this. When you go to a dump site, you don't know for sure that they're actually still using these questions on the exams, right?
That's
because
another
they do
point altogether. Yep.
Yeah, they do frequently change the questions. And the other thing is, if you're taking this exam, it's probably to prove that you actually know how to administer Azure. And so if you're just memorizing questions, you don't really know how to administer Azure, right? And so
yeah, you're going to wind up in an interview and someone's going to start asking you questions about, hey, you want to deploy an RDS farm in Azure. How do you set up the virtual networking? And I mean, there's no dumps for that.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see, who are we on now? Is it you? I forget.
I think it is me, yeah. What is it? How the benefits? There we go. How will I benefit from getting this certification? Well, for starters, you're going to open more doors than are open to you right now, because many job postings in the IT field right now, at least those that revolve around administration, are going to list the Azure Administrator certification as a requirement. And even if it's not a requirement, if you're up against 15 other people for a position, I can tell you that the 5 that do have it are going to be looked at a lot more closely than the 10 that are not. So you're certainly giving yourself more of an opportunity to land a job that you're interviewing for. I mean, let's face it, having the certification does not necessarily mean you're an expert, and employers know that. But what it does do is show that you've passed some sort of requirements that demonstrate you know something, and something's better than nothing. So it's the only way you have to demonstrate your knowledge of the subject content. Now, more importantly, because the certifications are valuable for Microsoft partners, that gives you more value in return. And what I mean by that is, if I'm a gold partner with Microsoft, I have to have so many different people on staff that hold certain certifications. If I'm Azure centric, I'm going to need a certain number of people on my staff that have those Azure certs. A lot of times these partners lose people. They go to another company, they retire, whatever the case may be. And to maintain that partner status and to maintain the benefits and the cost savings that go along with those benefits, they need to replace people with people who have the certs. So that gets back to the job postings requiring these certs to get hired, because they need someone to come in quickly to fill that cert requirement. So that value that it brings to the partners and the different MSPs is really key for you to get those certs. And then, of course, people with those certifications will often command higher salaries. That's not a hard and fast rule, but the fact of the matter is, if you have someone who's got 18 certifications and someone who's got none, I mean, it stands to reason the person who's demonstrated their knowledge is probably going to wind up with a higher salary than the person who doesn't.
All right. Yeah, I don't have anything to add there. Good coverage. And I'm realizing that we're coming up on the top of the hour here, so we'll have to get through these pretty quickly because we've got tons of questions that came in from the audience.
Yeah.
So how can I increase my chances of passing the exam? So of course, we're a little bit biased, but we recommend taking Cloud Academy's AZ 103 or AZ 104 learning path. And our learning paths include video-based courses, hands-on labs, and practice exams. And there are the links to those two. One of the questions that came in was, so which one should I take now, the AZ 103 or AZ 104? I recommend studying for the AZ 104 because you don't know exactly how long it's going to take you to prepare. And the AZ 103 exam is going to go away. So I would definitely go for AZ 104. And I think this was the last of our submitted questions. Yep. So let's move on to the Q&A. And I mean, there are lots of questions that came in, which is great. I'm just going to go through some of them pretty quickly. So, can all Microsoft Azure exams now be taken remotely from home via the proctored online experience? Yes, and I recommend it. It actually, well, I could answer this one for a long time, but I won't. But if you're going to do it from home, be careful. I would say use a Windows laptop and not a Mac. There can be problems with the Mac. I tried that once and it was a severe problem. So I've always used Windows laptop since then. But it actually works quite well taking the exam from home. They've really streamlined the process, and it's worth doing. What do I need to have to be well equipped for the lab of this exam? I already have Office 365 account, which will enable me to delve into Active Directory. Yeah, that's not going to be nearly enough. I mean, sure, that will help with the Active Directory part of things, but you need to have the hands-on Azure experience, the Azure portal experience. And as we said, one of the easiest ways to do that is to use our labs. I don't know if we mentioned it or not, but when you do the labs in our learning paths, you don't have to have an account. You don't get charged anything extra for taking the labs, like it's all just included in our subscription. But even if not, you could do a free trial of the Microsoft Azure. Like you can get a trial account, which is good for, I think it's a year now, and you just get a certain number of credits, like $300 in credits or something like that. Since I'm going to register for my exam, oh, and no, we already took that one, or covered that one. Does Microsoft tell you in the multi-answer question stems exactly how many answer choices you must choose, like Amazon does in its exams? So for example, choose 3 answers. Yes, they do that. So you don't have to worry about figuring out what the right number of things to answer is. In the labs in the exam, are you able to achieve the task through any method, or is Microsoft looking for a specific way? I'll let you take this one, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, you can go through the actual lab itself, and as long as you get to the correct answer, you're good. Now, for example, in this question here, it mentioned using CLI or using the portal click by click where possible. That's going to be it depends. I mean, if the question is asking you specifically, go do this via, the CLI, then you're going to have to know the commands to do it. If you're going to do it through PowerShell, you need to know how to do it. But generally speaking, what the labs will often do is just say, here's a scenario. You're trying to set up, let's Azure file sync between New York and California. Go. And if you can get it working, then you're good to go. So, I mean, it depends on how specific the lab questions are, especially when it revolves around this particular wording of this question. But ultimately, the rule of thumb is as long as you get the answer they're looking for, you're probably good to go.
All right. Go through a few more here. Can you give an example of a lab? So a lab task might be something like create an Azure storage account with these characteristics, like with these settings, that is, or create a virtual machine, or I don't know, or set up, yeah, put some particular settings into a SQL database instance or things like that. Like they're relatively straightforward usually.
Now I'll tell you, yeah, a question I can remember revolved around, and I obviously I can't give the exact wording, but essentially, a question I had at one point was, you have these 2 different sites, and you need to load balance a web app. You got to make sure people can access it close to them. How do you do it? And you had to go in and you got to build your VMs. You got to make sure they're load balanced. You got to make sure that you deploy solutions that minimize latency. It's essentially an architecture is usually what you'll wind up with. You'll have a question that says you need to build solution XYZ. Sometimes it'll give you like some hints on what components if you really read the question, but ultimately it's going to ask you to build a solution, whatever that solution is, and then it basically says, here you go, have at it.
Yeah. Okay. Is AZ 104 doable without any hands-on experience? I've already passed the AZ 900. Yeah, you don't need hands-on experience to pass AZ 900 for sure. But I highly recommend that you have hands-on experience for passing AZ 104. In theory, you might be able to do it without having hands-on experience, but you really should get some. Another person asked, I have cleared my AZ 103 recently. Do I need to give, or take, I guess, AZ 900 too? No, you don't need to. I mean, unless it's a requirement for some reason from an employer. But if you have AZ 103, there's no reason you should have to take AZ 900. Excuse me. I have to say though that some people do put strange things in their job postings. So they'll say like, you need to have AZ 900 and AZ 301. what? That doesn't make any sense, right? First of all, they're at opposite ends of the spectrum as far as the certifications go. And secondly, just having the AZ301 doesn't even get you a certification because you need both AZ300 and 301, right? So you will see weird things on job postings sometimes, but anyway, for this particular question, no, you generally shouldn't need to have AZ900 if you have AZ103. Another question is, how long is the AZ104 certification valid? And it's 2 years. Basically, all of their certifications now go for 2 years, and then you have to take an exam to renew them. And we are at the top of the hour. There are actually quite a few more questions in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to respond to these questions in one way or another. We still haven't decided on which way we're going to get the answers to you. At the very least, we should get them to the people who asked the questions if we have that information. But I think we'll end it here if Tom doesn't have anything else to add.
No, I mean, there are quite a few questions here. I mean, we'd probably be here another hour at least going through these. So I think we'll call it a wrap, and Guy and I'll kind of regroup and decide how we want to address these questions. It looks like there's a lot of duplicates in here too. So we'll come up with a way that makes the most sense and get some of these questions answered.
Right. Okay, so that's all we have time for today. Thank you all for participating and for sending in so many questions. It's been great, both before and during the webinar. You'll receive the recording after this session, so stay tuned for that. At the end of this webinar, a quick survey will pop up, and we'd really appreciate it if you could take a couple of minutes to answer it. So thanks, and see you in our next webinar.